Welcome to the Reality Taboo podcast. It's December 9th, 2023. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. We're going to discuss COVID generally and specifically the United States Army's mandate and subsequent repeal of the mandate for the COVID vaccine. We'll also discuss three of the most significant foreign policy events of the past 4 years: Afghanistan withdrawal, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Israel-Hamas. So what got me interested in this topic originally was this letter I came across dated January 10th, 2023. It's written by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, announcing the repeal of the COVID-19 vaccine requirement for all service members. So the letter starts with talking about how successful the mandate was, how many lives were saved, how it improved the fighting force, and generally was a great thing. And yet at the same time, it talks about how the repeal or how the vax is no longer required. So that just struck me as inherently contradictory. So I wanted to explore what was the original reason for the mandate and why did they repeal it?
The reason for the mandate was to funnel money to the pharmaceutical industry. That was the reason for the mandate. The reason for the rescinding the mandate, I think it's a confluence of factors. For one thing, it came in the beginning of this year, of 2023, which is right after the Republicans had retaken the House. And so it was a pretty easy sop, I think, politically, to trade what had already kind of run its course. I think the pharmaceutical companies are happy. They wanted to shoot for the moon with the vaccine, and we've gone through those battles over the last couple of years. And ultimately, they settled on kind of getting like a silver prize, where the COVID regime of shots is going to be comparable to what they do with flu vaccines every year. They're not going to be able to mandate it across the entire country to everyone. The boosters have come up short in that regard, but they haven't been a total failure. They can run parallel alongside the flu vaccines that come out each year. And so we'll have COVID shots each year, we'll have flu shots each year. But there are real, as we'll get into, real recruitment goal issues that the military is coming up short on, and the vaccine mandate was part of that. So rescinding the mandate made sense politically.
Calling a vaccine is Orwellian. The definition of vaccine was actually changed to accommodate the COVID-19 mRNA, quote, vaccine. It is not actually a vaccine as we've traditionally known that word. So the definition pre-COVID vax was, quote, a product, this is from the CDC, a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease, protecting the person from that disease. And after the COVID vaccine was foisted upon us, they changed the definition to, quote, a preparation that is used to stimulate the body's immune response against diseases. So
effectively, it became a multivitamin. That's what that is. It's like taking a vitamin C pill. Ideally, this will help boost your immune system response to issue XYZ, but it doesn't actually have to offer full protection.
And this technology, the MR, at least the Pfizer shot, I'm not sure on the other ones, but that was mRNA technology, which the defenders of the vax will say, well, this is technology that goes back decades. This is not, quote, new technology. But this is the first time the technology has been used in humans. And there's a reason that vaccines take 7, 8+ years of trials just to be put on the market. This thing was put on the market in, a year and a half? Anyway, let's talk about the recruitment numbers in the military. So I have a few stats to get us started. This is from the Military Times. From late 2021 to early 2023, the military services discharged roughly 8,300 troops from the active and reserve components, most of whom received general discharges and were welcome to serve in uniform again if they got vaccinated. So from what I understand, roughly 8,300 troops were discharged purely because they refused to get the shot. And so I can't help but think that that the recruitment numbers being so below what they're shooting for has something to do with why they repealed the mandate. What do you think about that, Thomas?
So if 8,000 left in response to the mandate that they didn't want to take, and we see that the Army was missing its recruiting goal by 15,000 soldiers, that cuts the recruiting loss in half if you're able to get those vax hesitant people who left back into the military, but vanishingly few of them actually did come back upon the mandate being changed. So this might be like a Bud Light sort of situation where the people who have vaccine hesitancy have the door shut on the military now, and this letter to try to bring them back in is not going to be much more effective than any of the other recruiting goals that the military has been pushing, or the recruiting campaign that the military has been pushing that's coming up short on.
And I don't know, maybe you don't think this even matters, that it's logical or there's a rational reason for all of this, but I couldn't help but notice the January 2023 DoD memo that announces the repeal of the mandate starts with, quote, "The department's COVID-19 vaccination efforts will leave a lasting legacy in the many lives we saved, the world-class force we have been able to field, and high level of readiness we have maintained amidst difficult public health conditions." So they're
everything they say is a lie. The military's performance was atrocious in Afghanistan. We have egg on our face from leaving in Afghanistan, and the promises about victory and support of the Ukraine effort in Russia has completely fallen apart, despite the fact that the United States bankrolled Ukraine to the extent that Ukraine was spending 4 times as much in that conflict that Russia's mopping the floor with.
And so 96% of the force, they say, is fully vaccinated. So that obviously 96% is far. That number is, there's no way that 96% of the force would have chosen to get vaccinated. So the vast majority of the service members just went along with this vaccination, presumably against their better judgment.
It is part of the culture of the military, though, for service people to be vaccinated. They're like pin cushions, the number of needles that they take for deployments all over the world. There are a lot of requirements in a lot of different countries. And
I have spoken to friends of mine that is their exact mentality, that, well, I get poked with so many different things. Every time I go overseas, they poke me with something else. It's just one of another vaccine of many that I've received before. So to me, that gets back to what we were saying about changing the definition of the vaccine, because if they're just using that word vax, it's like, well, this is just another vax. This is like you get the flu shot, you get hepatitis, all these things. But the reality is this shot, the COVID shot, is qualitatively different than those other shots. And I think that's one of many things that's insidious about it. It's making people think that this is something very similar to what they've gotten before, when in reality this is a new technology and inherent, just not proven to be safe despite what they say.
Yeah, so they assume that it was going to be just like the other needles that they took in the arms, but then there's been a bunch of that died suddenly, and the political and cultural issues that blew up around the vaccine, and the fact that it was rushed through in a way that was so much different than everything else that had been explained in the past. The necessity of going through the 7 or 9 year testing process and having the FDA do the double-blind tests and all of these sort of things that were thrown out the window for Operation Warp Speed. And so it probably did open a lot of people's eyes to the fact that this was qualitatively different than vaccines that they had received in the past.
And something else that caught my eye, there's a technical term in the military when you can change, you under certain circumstances you can get a change to they call it a correction of your military record. And I'm certainly not an expert on this, but from my research, the only I'm reading from the government's website. They say, quote, "To justify any correction, it is necessary to show to the satisfaction of the board that the alleged entry or omission in the records was an error or unjust." So if that's the only two ways you can get a quote correction, is you show that it was an error or unjust. Is the military admitting that having the vax requirement was either erroneous or unjust? Does this even matter? Are we foolish to even talk about this, to apply rationality again and logic?
Yeah, I think tacitly that is the admission. If you read between the lines in the preamble of all the bluster about how effective the vaccine was and how great it was, that it made our military force ready to fight and perform so stellarly as they have across the globe over the last few years. That is a conclusion that you can't help but draw.
And I'm going to give just a little more information on the recruiting. I think it's fair to call it a crisis. If you think that the military-industrial complex should keep rolling on as it has, I think there genuinely is a crisis for that machine to keep rolling. So I have this article from military.com. Of the 5 Defense Department service branches, only 2 met their active duty and listed recruiting goals for fiscal year 2023. The Marine Corps and the Space Force. And those are by far the smallest services and have the lightest recruiting burden. So the other 3, the Army, Air Force, and the Navy, fell short. So every service, with the exception of the Marine Corps, which barely met their numbers. Why do you think they're missing these numbers?
It's another confluence of factors. There's a large percentage of the potentially eligible population that is ineligible for psychological, mental, physical reasons. There also is, I think there's kind of a fatal conceit that the military-industrial complex thought following 9/11, the Second Iraq War, the perpetual war on terror, the shifting of the military from something that's surprising back in the Vietnam era. Vets and current active duty military were 2-to-1 Democrat at the time, and now fast forward to today, and that ratio has flipped almost perfectly, where it's 2-to-1 Republican. And so I think the presumption was that Middle America would provide military fodder indefinitely. No matter what happened to the military, it was still going to be people who wanted to be Marines were still going to become Marines. People who wanted to become Green Berets were going to become Green Berets, and it didn't matter if the woke recruiting ads talked about lesbians with Hispanic lesbians with mental issues and how they had overcome social anxiety and that sort of thing, or the Rachel Levine types, the things that we wouldn't historically conflate with military desirability. I think that the thought was that because the military was one of these always trusted institutions, that they could do whatever they wanted and we would still get the recruitment numbers that we needed to get. And we're finding out that that's not the case.
And they are, I have noticed a change in the, I guess you'd call it the public relations aspect, when, as you said, I think it was probably 2, 3, 4 years ago when they had that lesbian ad where she talked about the 2 mommies from San Francisco. And then I noticed, in contrast, just in the last month or two, they seem to be revisiting that classic campaign from, I believe, the 1990s, "Be All That You Can Be." And it's very it's a lot less melanin in those ads.
Yeah, there was that one that went pretty viral on Twitter I think almost all of them, there was maybe one black male sergeant, but almost everybody in the ad was Middle American, traditional, from central casting for what you would expect to have as a soldier. And the reaction to those, talk about an advertisement getting ratioed. It was really comical to read through how obvious it was to at least the commentariat on Twitter that they're really singing a different tune now that the shortfall in personnel recruitment had become real.
And I also can't help but think the renaming of many of the bases has some sort of effect on, like you were saying, it's just another example of the establishment thinking that they can basically do whatever they want. They can run ads about black lesbians. That's who they want to recruit. They can change the names of the bases. Historically, it's still the case, I assume, that military recruits are disproportionately white Southern men. And their ancestors, many of them fought in the Confederacy and probably fought with the men whose names are on those bases that they've changed now in the South.
Yeah, changing the names of the military bases is a really on-point way of telling that historical demographic base of the military that we're not interested in you. We don't want you here. You're not welcome here. But we still need you here, I think, is what we're discovering now, because as the military, as we get involved in Eastern Europe and now with the conflagration in the Middle East and the saber rattling with China over Taiwan, we're finding out that this isn't like a lot of other aspects of contemporary the contemporary world in terms of like academia and a lot of these cubicle farms and these positions that are filled with people like big corporations hiring people for affirmative action reasons, people who don't necessarily need to do anything. There's so much bloat, but they can still afford to lard the companies up with the bloat. That's different in the military, because when it comes down to it, you need people to be on the ground with guns, with boots on the ground, and be able to competently execute missions.
So we're recording this on December 9th, 2023, and right now there's a kabuki theater going on between the Republicans and the Democrats. They're supposedly wrangling over approving a budget. The Republicans are saying that we're happy to sign off on $10 billion to send to Israel, to send to Ukraine, to send to China and Taiwan, but you have to give us in return a little bit more border security. And first of all, I find it, as an American, I genuinely find it humiliating that border security is nothing more than just a chip, a tool that these politicians, the establishment, throws back and forth just as a bargaining chip. It's almost something incidental rather than the whole point of their existence. I'm looking at a Wall Street Journal article from December 4th. So the headline is, U.S. running out of money for Ukraine in war with Russia, White House warns. And the President Biden has outlined a $106 billion proposed, quote, aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. And the package requested about $60 billion to fund the Ukraine war effort and replenish U.S. weapons stocks. And looking through this, many arguments, the standard national security arguments, and this is actually going to protect the United States. Those kind of arguments are made, of course. But one thing that stood out, something that stood out to me in the article, I'm quoting the White House used Monday's letter to make the case to skeptical Republicans in Congress that funding will offer direct benefits to the U.S. by boosting the American defense industry. 60% of the money that has been approved so far by Congress has supported the U.S. defense industrial base or boosted Defense Department and intelligence operations, she wrote. So you don't usually see the military-industrial complex laid quite so bare as you do there. So what do you make of that?
It's standard Keynesianism. It's the United States spends more on its military than what the next top 2 through 10 countries combined. And the argument here is that spending even more will continue to boost the economy and will pay dividends to Americans.
So do you think they've given up on the vaunted counteroffensive that we heard so much about back earlier this year? This was it. This was going to be Ukraine's way to push back Russia, and we just need a little bit more support. And here we are at the end of 2023, and we're essentially at the same point we were, or maybe Russia's actually made some progress since then.
Yeah, Russia's going to end up with more land than what they would have ended up if Zelensky and Putin would have come to a ceasefire agreement a year and a half ago, the one that was killed by Boris Johnson and the West. But it's just being respun now as a victory that Ukraine only lost 20% of its land and was able to hold on to 80%. But this bill came up short. I think it was over immigration is where the issue broke down, but it got voted down, this funding request.
And I wonder how many of the Republicans even care about securing the border. Do you think maybe a few are genuinely want to secure the border, or like I said, is this all kabuki theater and they're just using the border as simply a bargaining chip?
Oh yeah, it's all theater. How much money does it take to secure the border? It's a question of will, not a question of funding. It doesn't matter how many people you have at the border if the process is that when migrants come and meet up with border agents and claim asylum, that they are processed and then given asylum hearing dates that they're supposed to show up for, and that if they do show up for something, over 90% will get approved. A lot of them won't show up for the asylum hearings at all, and they'll just disappear into the interior of the country. And so if you have 10 people doing that process at a checkpoint, or 100 people, or 1,000 or 10,000 people doing the processing at the checkpoint, if the process is still the same, then there's no amount of money that's going to stop the crossings if there are no deportation actions, either at the border where people are turned away or once people get into the country. So yeah, it's clearly all just theater.
Immigration is something that you've paid close attention to over the years. How has your thinking on that issue evolved?
Well, it's more that my thinking on the issue of the United States as a unified political, cultural, economic entity has changed. I think dissolution is in the future. I think the only thing that's tying the whole thing together right now is the economic convenience, to really drill down, the strength of the U.S. dollar, and that is in the process of breaking. And once that breaks, I think political dissolution will be right behind it. And so I no longer think of, when I contextualize these things, when I conceptualize them, I should say, I no longer think of what's happening in, say, New Mexico or Arizona, what's happening in my country. I'm a lot more focused on what's happening locally.
Let's focus in on when you became truly black-pilled on the immigration demographic situation for the United States. In 2016, when Trump was elected and the MAGA movement was at its highest point, at that point, did you still think there was some hope?
I would say in 2014, 2012, 2010, I did not think that there was any hope. And even though I was one of the earliest members to get on the Trump train, long before a lot of people in my life, even people who politically were fellow travelers up to that point, got on the train, I still thought it was too good to be true. But as I kept thinking it was too good to be true, I was really tied into sort of the meme magic and the insane reaction by all of the power centers to this person, and the fact that when you really distilled down what his campaign was about, there were three things that were just like, if I had three wishes for what I would like to see change in contemporary America, those three things were what he was about. One, it was his campaign was a referendum on a wall. That was one thing. Two, he had brought back the quote isolationist unquote Republican strain that existed on the American right all the way back from the America First movement, Charles Lindbergh, through Barry Goldwater to some extent, and of course people like Pat Buchanan. And then his campaign was also a war on the stifling political correctness that was in the process of threatening to destroy the freedom of the internet from that golden age from like 2006 to 2016. And so it felt like it was impossible not to feel as though maybe this was like the sort of Prester John that we had all been waiting for. And so I became a little bit more engaged. Maybe there were a couple white pills in 2016. And then, of course, the election itself in 2017. But it quickly became apparent after that he wasn't intellectually serious about what he was doing. And that was to be expected. He was a game show host. He's a celebrity. But what I did have higher hopes, and that I thought he would at least, what he was famous for was personnel, right? Was The Apprentice, being able to find the right person for the right job. And yet he just made terrible personnel choices one after another. He didn't know anybody in D.C. at all. And instead of taking somebody like Buchanan and making him chief of staff and just being like, hey, Pat, tell me, is this guy for me or not? Pat Buchanan could have told him yes, yes, no, 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 yes, no, yes, no. He could have gotten people like Ann Coulter to do the same thing. Instead, he brought on the people with the most impressive resumes, and so it quickly became apparent that he was in way over his head, that he was going to be stifled at every turn, and that he wasn't really even serious about a lot of the campaign things. He'd been out on the campaign trail. He reacted to the crowds in those extemporaneous rallies that he did. He saw what lines got a lot of applause and what lines led to the crowd chanting, and so he calibrated his campaign message throughout the 2015-2016 campaign based on the feedback he got from the grassroots, but there was no rigorous implementation of that at all once he got into office. And so I would say by 2017 or 2018, it was back to where I was in 2015, 2014. And before that, thinking that dissolution of the United States was inevitable, although I hesitate a little bit to call that a black pill, because I think it's just inevitable. I think it's part of the demographic change. It's part of the cultural change. The United States is too big. Empires are not good. That's not what the Western spirit is.
So it sounds like you've really had a philosophical change in your outlook on the United States as an entity and your role or your place within that entity.
Yeah, it's not my it's not my country anymore. It's not a country for me. It's not a country for my family, for the people that I care about. To put it in Jack Donovan's words, I realized that I've become a new barbarian, and that I'm effectively living in occupied territory ruled by people who don't have my best interests at heart. The well-being of the United States as an institution is currently constituted is no longer synonymous with the well-being of the United States is not synonymous with my own well-being. Effectively, I guess I'm saying that I'm rooting against the United States in a lot of these foreign conflicts.
I can relate to that. It's actually been a disturbing change in my own outlook on things. I consider myself a very patriotic person, always have been growing up at least. But in the last few years, things have changed where it's to the point where I'm actively rooting against the United States. I hope that whatever the foreign policy objectives they're putting forth, I hope that they fail. I hope that Russia wins. I really don't care what happens in Israel and Hamas. I don't care if Israel wins. All of these staples of of the United States foreign policy objectives, I find myself rooting against them.
Well, what I don't want from Israel and Hamas is for refugees from that crisis to end up here in the Western world. That, to the extent that I'm concerned at all, it's how it affects me and the people inside my Dunbar's number. And I'm so cynical now at this point where I don't think at all that any of the the ruling powers, any of the institutions of power in the West are concerned about the same things that I'm concerned about. So it really is in my interest, my posterity's interest, for these institutions to fail. And so to the extent that
I think we both agree then that the bottom line is we view ourselves as individuals as separate from the United States as an entity, not only separate but opposed. The interests are contrary to each other.
Yeah, the things that the U.S. government is trying to do to spread across the globe are things that are antithetical to my best interests.
Right. Well, on that note, let's wrap things up. We've strayed a bit from our original topic, but
hey, well, it's the inaugural recording of the reality taboo, and so we're setting a baseline here, and so we only have up. There's only one direction to go, and it's up from here. So I think we can sign off on that note.